Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have my best friend, Kim.
Hello. Thank you for having me on your channel.
So she is my flatmate and best friend, and we met last year. So we're gonna tell you a bit of a story about how we met and also some similarities we have in common. And if you have, watching my channel because you have Turner syndrome, and we actually found out together that we both have Turner syndrome.
Yeah.
So
what are the odds?
yeah, it's a very universal thing that brought us together.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, we both go to university in London, and we met last year, our first year of university, and we became friends, and we actually didn't find out that we had Turner syndrome in common until like a month after we met. But and now we're best friends, and we have a flat together here.
Heck yeah.
So
in the background.
Yeah.
I would love to leave that.
There will be a flat tour coming up.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're just gonna talk about like our diagnosis, or your diagnosis of Turner syndrome, and just how maybe it's different for us and maybe how it's similar for us. So why don't you tell everyone like how you were diagnosed?
Yeah, so I've always been kind of short. Like throughout school and everything, I was always the shortest person. And whenever I went to the doctors, they'd always tell my parents like, "Oh yeah, you're just short. There's nothing to be overly concerned about. Like you may have growth spurt when you get a little bit older," which they tell a lot of short people, and it never happens. But yeah, and so at the time we were living in the South, and so our doctors didn't really think it was anything to be concerned about. But then we moved to Washington DC, which is when my pediatrician, took one look at me and was like, "Hey, you might want to get tested for this. I think this is a possibility that you might have Turner syndrome." And so that was kind of a scary notion for me because I had never heard of it and had never really understood, any type of syndrome or how that could affect people. So I did what most people would probably do and went on the internet and searched up all the symptoms and everything like that, and I was kind of going down the list and was like, I have this, I don't have that, all of that. But yeah, I eventually got tested and I did have Turner syndrome, and I have the same type of Turner syndrome as Ian, which is mosaic Turner syndrome. So only a part of my X chromosome is missing.
Yeah, so we're both not classic.
Yeah.
Both mosaic. You were in the South, and it's interesting that when you moved somewhere else, it's kind of when they figured out that.
Yeah.
See, that's interesting. Like for me, it was always like a possibility that I could have it, like going to doctors, because I was in California. It's very looks based, so they were always worried about me being short, and my doctors always knew I'm behind the growth curve. And so and eventually I got tested for it, but at first my parents weren't concerned about it, because my whole family is short, so but yeah, and I was always the shortest in my classes as well, and eventually I had to get growth hormone, and when I was about 7 or 8, and I wasn't diagnosed till I was 10 after I got tested. But yeah, that's where I guess we're different in our diagnoses. But so did you start growth hormone before you were diagnosed, or?
Yeah, so because I've always been short and been behind the growth curve, my doctor did put me on growth hormone for a little bit without being diagnosed with Turner syndrome. So yeah, we did that for a little bit, but it was one of the first what's it called, forms of growth hormone, I guess. So it's quite difficult to do, and so we stopped that. But as soon as we had a formal diagnosis, then I started growth hormone again.
Yeah.
I was able to get a little bit of height out of it because I still could.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think you were telling me about the kind of growth hormone that you took, and it was very, it seemed very difficult, but yeah. yeah, for me, I just had to get a shot every day, which
Yeah.
as a kid, that's not fun.
no.
But yeah, and I know I would go to my dad's house every weekend, and he didn't want to do it. He didn't know how to do it, so
Yeah.
during the weekend, I wouldn't have that. But yeah, it's just something you get used to, I guess. And now I'm not as scared of needles because you know, I'm used to that all the
You're so
time.
used to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, like before, I don't know how many of your viewers and subscribers know about growth hormone, but like the one I took was basically like you had to mix the medicine in the syringe and then inject it. So it was like a big long process, and then you had to put the needle on and everything. So it was like really complicated and not fun to do.
Right.
Or to, get. But then we got like a really simple one that already had it. And so it was just one injection and it was really
Yeah, and I'm not very familiar with like different types of growth hormone, but yeah, like I said, the one that I had was just a shot every day, and I still remember like the nurses coming over to my house when I was young to tell my mom about how to use it and show her. And I remember being terrified, like I hid in my room because I didn't want to, I didn't want to have to deal with that. But eventually, and yeah. So also because I have rheumatoid arthritis, I had to take a shot every day as well with that. So or like Enbrel, if any of you know about that one. So that's why I'm very used to needles and stuff like that. The next thing I want to talk about is, so after you were diagnosed, did you go to any like support groups or stuff like that? Find anyone online?
Yeah, well, I went to the Turner Syndrome Convention the first year that I was diagnosed, which was in Buffalo, New York, and so I was able to be around and get educated on Turner Syndrome and kind of what that entails for different people.
Yeah.
So I met a lot of really awesome people that, had just been diagnosed or had been diagnosed for years and had been living with it, and just to get their experience and all the different forms of Turner Syndrome that there were, and because it's such a big spectrum. But yeah, I also, while we were there, got some tests done as well, like cardiac tests and things like that, to make sure that my heart was okay, because that's also one of the big
yeah, that's quite
things.
scary,
Yeah,
isn't it? Yeah.
exactly. So I did find out that I had kind of an enlarged aorta that I kind of had to keep an eye on throughout the years, which is probably one of the other big things that I had to kind of keep track of and keep up with.
Yeah, I'm sure like you said, people with Turner syndrome, they tend to have like other things that they need to keep up with, and like heart issues are very concerning, and so it is important to get that checked a lot. Like for me, I have a heart murmur, and I don't know if that's like a Turner's thing, because I think my mom has it and another family member has it as well, so it might just be in my family, but that's something that I need to get checked as well. But obviously anything with the heart or any other complications from Turner syndrome, it's important to get that checked. And yeah, and I mean, it's just I didn't go to any support groups, but I did years later found Facebook support groups and stuff like that, which are great because I get a lot of my questions that I've had, and because you don't really meet anyone with Turner syndrome because it's very rare. Luckily I met you and everything, but yeah, so it's just interesting to see the similarities we have, and maybe some things that I didn't know were Turner's related, I found out through that support group. But yeah, and we're very lucky that we don't have a lot of issues that a lot of people with Turner's do, and it's really sad to hear about babies that are diagnosed before they're even born. They have a lot of issues and they might not even make it. That's what's really saddening. But yeah, like for me, I was never, like they could never tell, like before I was born, that I had anything. So yeah, I wasn't diagnosed till years later, but that's kind of, and I mean, a lot of people with Turner's have different, kind of like severities of it, obviously, but yeah, so some of them might be diagnosed earlier in life or later in life, but Yeah. After you were diagnosed, I'm just wondering, like, how did it affect you? Like, did you feel like it defined you, or like, what were your feelings about it?
Well, it was really nice to like put a name to it, you know, because I've always been short and I was always wondering why.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was adopted, so, you know, my parents didn't have a lot of information on my background, especially my genetic background. And so it was, you know, nice to know that I actually did have something that I could kind of treat and had to be aware of. And like, it's kind of something that I use, like, if anyone teases me about it, I'm like, I have Turner syndrome, like, you can't tease me.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was not something that really defined me so much as it was just nice to know and good to know that I was not alone.
Yeah, and I think you have an interesting life story. Why don't you tell people, because you were, like you said, adopted, and obviously they didn't know that you had Turner syndrome, and your parents didn't know until later on. So, so where were you adopted from, and like, tell us your story about like your parents finding you and all of that.
Yeah, so I was adopted from Vietnam when I was 9 months old, and my parents basically had a whole year process, I think, before that, of, you know, filling in adoption applications and, you know, finding an orphanage that really worked with, you know, what they were kind of wanting to do. They got sent a bunch of pictures of different kids to kind of look at and see which one they might potentially want to adopt, and I was one of them. And yeah, I had this really funny like expression on my face, and so they were like, yeah, that one's the one for us. Yeah, and so they came over to Vietnam and got to meet me, and then they had to go back, and I had to get a bunch of medical tests while I was in Vietnam to make sure I was healthy to come home. And then 2 months later, they picked me up and we flew back to America. Yeah.
So where were you living, like, when you were first adopted, like when you came to America?
So when I first came to America, we were living in Arizona, which is kind of where I grew up, and then we moved all around the country and then came back to Arizona, which is where I did like middle school and high school, and I graduated from. So yeah.
But like the picture that your parents saw, I think it really matches your personality now.
Yeah.
But yeah, Kim is just, anyone that knows her, she's just such a sweet girl, and you know, we're very similar in a lot of ways. So that's why we're really best friends. But it's just interesting and great to have that connection with someone that also has Turner's. And like for me, what I have found is a lot of the people in my support group, anyone that I know that, you know, has Turner's, I think our personalities are quite similar, and I don't know if any of you with Turner's have found that to be true as well. I think we're all children at heart and all of that. And so yeah, and then also, why don't you tell us about, like, do you want kids in the future, and like how does that affect you?
Yeah, so I've always wanted kids, and I've always really wanted to adopt, so the fact that I can't have kids naturally isn't really the biggest deal for me, because I've always wanted to adopt kids. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm planning for the future.
Yeah, I mean, if any of you are Turners, if you can relate as well, it may be difficult at first to find out that you can't have children naturally, but I think there's always ways of, you know, nowadays to, you know, have kids, and like you were adopted, so maybe that's something that you might want to do. You know, there's lots of other ways to have kids, and you can't just let that define you. As well as just having the diagnosis of Turner syndrome, is you can't let that define you as a person, you know. Everyone has their own, you know, they're special in their own way and have their own personalities and all of that, and having something like an illness or a diagnosis does not define you as a person, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind, and I really hope this was helpful for all of you watching and very informative, and thank you for coming on my channel, Kim.
Thank you for having me.
If you have any questions for us, you can leave them in the comments down below.
Yes.
And I will leave my social media in the description below, and I'll also leave Kim's as well if you want to follow her. So yeah, thank you for watching, and thank you for being here, Kim.
Thank you for having me.